Hey, what's up, YouTube? Welcome back to part 2 of what is a dual sport. In the first video, I talked about some of the different things, that designate a dual sport being a dual sport, and talked about some of the bikes that are in that range. I made a spreadsheet of all the current dual sport models that are available that folks could potentially buy on a dealership today, or just recently they stopped making, like the WR250R. And today I want to look at all 24 of these bikes a little bit closer. So toward the end here, I'm also going to do a little bit of stat sheet racing. It was more than just looking at those 24 bikes, but also looking at, how much does each of them weigh? How much gas do they carry? How much suspension travel do these bikes have? So I made a big spreadsheet, so we're going to nerd out big time at the end. And ultimately, I think there's a hole in the dual sport market. I think there's a bike that most people that are doing real street and trail, spending time on the asphalt and also wanting to go deep in the woods, there's a bike that I think that these people, including myself, want, and currently no one makes that bike. So buckle up, and here we go. So currently, like I said, there are 24 different dual sports that are on the market. If you remember from the first episode, if you haven't seen that, I recommend that you go back and take a look at that. So the rules from the first episode were: what's a dual sport motorcycle? It has to have a 21-inch front wheel, it has to be a single cylinder engine, and it has to be sold from the factory with street legal equipment. I also include the caveat: this bike should probably be capable of finishing a hare scramble. That particular rule is going to be something like all these other things that are subjective, but it kind of eliminates bikes like the Royal Enfield Himalayan, the TW200, and some of the big twin-cylinder adventure bikes that people might want to throw in a dual sport, but I don't think it qualifies. More of that will come out later when we start looking at stats. It becomes very clear. So like I said, I went and I reached out on the internet and asked folks what they thought the best dual sports were. I went around to all the manufacturers' websites and I looked at different things. The first of the 24 that I want to talk about are the old school dual sports. I mean, ultimately, this ends up being the Honda XR650L, the Suzuki DR650, the Yamaha XT250, and then the Suzuki DR200. All these bikes are getting pretty long in the tooth. I know for pretty confidently the Honda dates back to like 1992. I would assume the other three bikes are relatively the same, and I have a feeling that unless they get upgraded like the KLR with fuel injection and some of the EPA requirements and whatnot, I suspect we may not see these for too much longer. So next, I talked a lot about the race bikes with plates. That's a big feature of the first episode that I talked about. These end up being the high performance machines, and for the most part, they're European. Two of these are from KTM. Beta makes 4 different models, like I said, and then the Honda 450L, and then there's 2 from a company called SWM, and we'll talk about them in a second. And most of the rest of these models end up being what I would consider, like I said, this 50-50 or even street-biased dual sports. And then what I said about Oddbirds, most people are familiar with the Japanese brands or those European brands, but there's a couple lesser known ones that are also street legal. It's interesting. SWM is actually a brand that I think got the intellectual property rights to the former Husqvarna designs. So when KTM bought Husqvarna, I think they bought the intellectual property, and these are actually the leftover engines for that. AJP is the other one. For folks who have been listening to the podcast, I got into that with a buddy of mine the other day. AJP is actually the same with respect to the Husqvarna 600 engine, but I believe that that is a self-built chassis, and they're buying high-end aftermarket parts to build basically replica rally bikes. So you've got, I don't know if it's Showa or whatever it is, suspension, Brembo brakes and all that other stuff, but they're using a proven engine. And then in this case, Zero is included here. Lots of people know Zero from street bikes and whatnot because they make electric bikes, but the Zero FX has got some pretty impressive stats that make it fit into this dual sport range, and it actually is better on paper than a lot of other bikes, but that's a taste thing. We'll get into that too. And then I want to point out some of the low maintenance bikes. If we're talking about race bikes with plates, and we're talking about like some of the old school bikes that have oil change intervals like 2,000, 3,000 miles, The really low maintenance machines that are available now, these newer ones, I mean, you only have to change oil every 6,000 miles or more. Like the CRF 300L is every 8,000 miles. The KTM 690 Enduro stands out here because, I mean, that actually evolved out of the Dakar Rally. The 690 is pricey, but you get a lot of motorcycle, a very capable machine for the money that you spend on that, and you spend a lot more time riding and less time wrenching. You know, the KLR falls into this one. Obviously, it's a heavyweight, but it's a serious mile-munching super tanker with like a 6-gallon gas tank. And then I mentioned the 300Ls, and you know the KLXs are in here too, which are, like I said, they're kind of like trail bikes, but they're street legal. So let's take a closer look at the numbers, and I'm going to do a little stat sheet racing. So hang with me here. Yeah, so like I said at the beginning of the video, you know, I found 24 different motorcycles that qualified as dual sports. And I started making a list in Excel because, you know, I'm an engineering nerd or whatever it was. So I started going to all of the manufacturers' websites and cataloging what dual sports they had. I put out some stuff on Instagram and asked people to tell me what dual sports there were. And there's probably some other odds and ends that fit in the category of dual sport based on the criteria I've set forth. But for the most part, these are the big names, and obviously, like I said before, you know, SWM and AJP are little odd birds by comparison. They're a little more rare, not nearly as many dealers. So I put the list together and started putting the prices on here. And then before long, I found myself, like, if I'm going to put it in Excel, then I might as well start putting some of the stats in it. From there, it was like, well, you know, what are the weights? You know, what is the horsepower? So I started going through the manufacturer's website specs, some of the reviews and stuff. I got the horsepower from I don't know if it was Cycle World, whoever does the dyno test. So these are actual rear wheel horsepower numbers, and then compression rating. And then I went into the owner's manuals and I put the service intervals on here. So this is the number of miles between oil changes, and then obviously, you know, transmission, 5-speed or 6-speed, suspension travel, whether or not it's fully adjustable or partially adjustable, what's the ground clearance, what is the total fuel capacity of the gas tank, and then price. And then, like we were talking earlier, like, so I separated this ahead of time, and it's color coded to race bikes with plates. These are kind of like the middle of the road bikes because these bikes are between 2,000 and 4,000 miles on their oil changes and whatnot. And then, you know, these are the low maintenance bikes here at the bottom, you know, the 690 Enduro and so on. And I talked about that. So these are ones that are, you know, 6,000 miles and up. And so I started looking at this, you know, looking at weight, and, you know, you can sort this based on, you know, which bike is actually the lightest. Yeah, it's kind of shocking to see that 0FX land on there. And then I chose compression ratio because it's like weight, you know, you want the lightest bike. Power, you want the bike that's the lightest but also has the most horsepower. And then I used compression ratio because on the CRF 450L, on my current KTM 350, which is plated, so it's the equivalent to the 350 EXCF, the high compression ratio means that the engine braking is extreme. And the 350 that I have and the 450L are both like really susceptible to flaming out. And I find that incredibly annoying. Now, there's more that goes into that than compression, but this represents how much stress is the engine under and what is the likelihood that you're going to have stalling or flame out issues with it. The race bikes with plates generally have this problem and are generally higher compression. I mean, look at that 350, 3.5 to 1 compression ratio. So that represents that piece of it. And as I started looking through all of this, I was like, you know, I could actually score these. So I went ahead and was like, you know what, let's do that. So I'm going to take each one of these categories and I'm going to sort it based on lightest weight and score it, you know, 1 through whatever. And if they're the same weight, then it's a tie. So 2 of these are the same weight at second place and so on. And then who has the most horsepower, so that should be the winner. You know, this is Olympic type scoring, so, you know, whichever one has the most horsepower is number 1 and so on. And then, like I just said about compression ratio, the lowest compression ratio should be the bike that is the most ideal for a dual sport environment. Now, if we were talking about race bikes or dirt bike, completely off-road trail bikes, that's one thing. But to me, this is a bike that we want to be able to ride on the asphalt and the dirt, and what is the best of both. And so that's why I see it in this way. Maintenance interval is the same. You know, what is the best performance I can get with the least amount of maintenance? You know, and there's that 0FX. It has no engine braking, has no maintenance other than buying tires and maybe changing a belt or a chain in this case, which you have to do with all of these. And then there's no transmission. Obviously, 6-speed would score higher, but there's no transmission on a 0. So it's in whatever gear you need it to be. And then, you know, what is the most suspension travel? And I would welcome an argument that said, seat height would have been a good criteria that we could have had here. So we could have measured that, and that's fine. And you could say, I want the most amount of, suspension travel with the lowest seat height and that kind of thing. And that's fair. And like I said, I'm willing to say that there are better ways to do this. The Olympic scoring, we could have scaled this on a scale of 1 to 10, and more subjective stuff. But I mean, like I said, we're stat sheet racing. Unless somebody gives me the keys to all 24 bikes, we're just kind of sitting here having a conversation. Fully adjustable suspension got scored higher than non-adjustable, and then obviously partially in the middle, ground clearance. And then even though I would like to know what the actual range is of each of these bikes, that is a better way for me to do that. It's a little tougher, especially with the race bikes with plates. That's not normally the kind of thing that's published. I probably could have looked it up, but in this case, I just chose. I'm going to represent it with the ones with the biggest gas tanks are scored the best. So in this case, actually, the range on the Zero made it last place and 12th place out of everything that's in here because a lot of these have the same size gas tank. And first being obviously the KLR. That thing's a super tanker. And then lastly was price. Which one is most expensive? So in setting this up, it's interesting to look at each of these individually based on these, lone statistics. And then if you've scored them in this way, and then smallest first. So there's the KTM 500, the Beta 500, basically the next two betas on a performance standpoint. That's the way, these work out. And it's kind of funny to see that XR 650L tied right with that Beta 390 because of horsepower. I mean, it weighs, almost 100 pounds more than these race bikes with plates, but low compression, double the maintenance interval, still has 11 inches of suspension travel. It's got a 2.8 gallon tank, but $7,000. If you can handle the weight and the seat height on this bike, I mean, that's an absolute steal compared to spending almost double for the bikes that are above it. So that's impressive to see that. And then the Zero as well, like, wow. Obviously not having a clutch, not having engine braking or different engine braking, not having a transmission, some of that stuff is stuff that, is arguable. And obviously I scored it poorly in range because I could pack extra gas with these other ones, but I'm like, that was impressive to see at 247 pounds. The Zero is very capable against the field. And then you got other stuff in the middle of the range, DRZ 400, that's a perennial favorite. To me, it's a little heavy at 320 pounds, but I mean, it's got plenty of horsepower. Engine compression's not bad. The interval on, changing oil's not a big deal. And people will niggle about it really needs a 6-speed and so on. But I mean, for $7,000, I mean, that's a hell of a motorcycle. And obviously things fall down. And I think in the end, you start looking down here at the SWM Super Dual and the KLR. I'm like, they're just heavy. So it's not surprising to see if we score this based on performance, the KLR is dead last because it's arguably an adventure bike depending on who you talk to. I mean, 450 pounds, it's right up against the T7 and the KTM 890. But I mean, it's a super tanker with the 6 gallons of gas, and for $6,700, that's still $3,000 cheaper than a T7. Double that price to get you up to a KTM 890. So it's a hell of a deal on a lighter weight adventure bike. So there's something to be said for that. And then that's what I'm saying about price. So if we score these based on cheapest to most expensive, and then score them that way and do the addition again, and we sum that up, and now price plays a factor in which bike is the best, it's really impressive to see that. And there it was, that Honda XR 650L, from 1992. For the money, this is the best bike that you could get in a dual sport category. Again, it's heavy, but when you look at all the other factors, I mean, it checks a lot of boxes for what makes a dual sport best. I was really shocked to see the CRF 300L Rally in this space. There you go, $6,000. And I really think that it's the big gas tank and then still reasonable suspension. It's heavy again, 330 pounds. Both of these are, heavyweight bikes. But then there's the Beta 500, the KTM 500 EXCs. It looks like it's behind, but the reality is 64 points. I mean, so we have every one of these bikes right here is tied for 4th place. So all of these are parallel in the concept of when you adjust performance per dollar. And, that CRF 450L I was talking about, it's in the middle. But it to me just blows my mind to see the CRF 300L. There you go, the DRZ. These bikes tied for performance per dollar. You know, one of these may be better for you, but you get a lot of bike for not a lot of money here, and it's really impressive to see that. Obviously, like I said, the Beta and the KTM 500 are up at the top here. And it's something I've been thinking about for a long time. Like I started talking about the 300L, the DRZ. Both of these bikes are heavy. I think the DRZ power is good, and I probably don't need that much. You know, at 23 horsepower, you know, the WR 250R is about the same, if I recall, which is actually not scored nearly as well here. I could probably do a little bit more. I'd like a little less weight. You know, that interval of 8,000 miles between oil changes is awesome, but I could probably live with 3,000. You know, I would like to see a little more suspension and whatnot. So when I looked at all of these numbers, I still think there's a bike that's missing in the field of all these ones that are available. So I was curious, you know, what are the averages? So, you know, median being what is the middle option out of all these bikes when you scale these up? And what is the average? So I looked at these stats, and I looked at specifically the 300L, but I mean, you could use the KLX 300, you could use the 250L, and look at that. And I was impressed to see that this median and average is pretty close to what I would want in an actual bike. And I'm like, you know what, let's make it. So I'm going to make this unicorn bike. And I'm going to say 291 pounds, because that's how much the CRF 450L weighs. There's 27 horsepower, so it's a little bit more, but not as crazy as like the 35-ish I think I've got on my 350. But I like that low compression ratio. That's been great on the 250L. 3,000 miles, like I said. I want a 6-speed, 11 inches of suspension travel, and the gas tank on the 300L is fine. I got 100 miles on the 250L, so that's good. I picked $7,600. It might be unrealistic to see a bike like this. I mean, how are we going to go from, you know, that 300L is 309 pounds. Can we chop 20 pounds off a bike and still make it for that? I don't know. Might be 8,000. But it's fascinating to see that, you know. So based on performance, you know, it's 6 bikes down here ish. Technically, it's tied with the 0. But when you adjust for dollars, you know, second place behind the XR 650L, you know, it just inches out the 300 Rally and the 500 because it's lighter and it has a little more horsepower and so on and so forth. It just, like I said, I think that these stats right here, if you are not a person that says, I want a race bike with a plate, if you're not a person that says, I just want a dirt bike that's street legal from the factory so I don't have to fuss with it. If that's your game, I get it. But when you are looking at these bikes down here, and you're a former 250L owner like myself, or you've had the KLX 300 and whatnot, I really think that you really want these stats. I don't need 12-inch suspension travel, but a little bit more than 10 would be good. I don't need it to be 250 pounds, but you know, every 10 pounds after that gets to be a lot, and it costs a lot to get there. So I could live with 290 odd pounds. A little bit more horsepower to off the front wheel. And like I said, you know, if compression ratio means it doesn't flame out or it's going to last longer or whatever, and like I said, 3,000 miles, I mean, that's triple, you know, maybe 6 times as much as you're going to work on a race bike. This is fine. I can do valves every 6,000 miles like I do on my Triumph and not worry about it. Sorry, it's 12,000. Anyway, like I said, that price tag, I mean, if we do largest to smallest, yeah, I mean, we start to get up in to super dual. I mean, so, you know, right now, as far as price is concerned, it's tied, you know, it's in between 9 and 10, but, you know, move it up another point. I don't think that's that big a deal. I mean, you could put maybe the Beta 500 in front of it, or in this case, put the two 500s in front of it. That's still a hell of a bike. I really think that this is the one that most people are interested in. So, and I guess with that, leave me with your comments. I mean, that's it. That I appreciate everybody getting into the deep dive and nerding out with all these stats. And I want to post them somewhere so if folks want to play around with them or critique or point out some mistakes that I've made or rebake them in some other way of something they think is more subjective or objective as far as scoring. But tell me what you think. Is there a bike missing from the dual sport world that is makeable. You know, could this unicorn bike be the WR350R? Could Yamaha make this bike if they're, you know, put their nose to the grindstone? Would people actually buy it? So leave me with a comment, and I'll catch y'all down the road.